Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri is a Martin McDonaugh film in which the aggrieved mother Mildred Hayes puts up three evocative billboards challenging the town's police chief, William Willoughby, to find her daughter's killer and rapist. While this succeeds in putting her case back in the public eye, it also earns her the considerable ire of the people around the town, particularly Willoughby's friend, Officer Dixon. Now, both Willoughby and Dixon have their own problems to attend to. Willoughby has terminal cancer, and Dixon is an archetype of a spiteful and hateful police officer. Jonathan Murray calls the film a tale about how rage can consume both those who experience it and those who are exposed to it. And I think the film, even though it was released in 2018 and was written many years earlier, does a really good job of not only diagnosing the problems of rage in America, but also in creating a sort of solution, albeit not a very hopeful one. I do agree with Murray that it doesn't really talk about race very well, and you can't really escape this when you're talking about anger in America, but what the film wants to talk about, it talks about very effectively. It presents two main characters who both suffer from severe emotional neglect, which leads to some directionless anger, which then spirals out of control into violent outbursts. And it's only when these two characters start to see eye to eye and empathise with each other that anything is actually solved at all. Before I begin, this is Why Vote Joe. It's a channel where I talk about politics, history, current affairs and things like that. If that's your cup of tea, which I assume it is because you're here, why not click subscribe and ring the bell in the box below just so you know the next time I make a video. I'm going to do some more stuff on film criticism and stuff like that as well. So if you like this one, definitely do subscribe. Mildred's three billboards are designed to create a reaction. They remind the viewer of the brutal circumstances of her daughter's murder, they challenge the police over their inaction, and they also single out Chief Willoughby as the head of the police. Now, neither Mildred nor Willoughby seem to have very much personal animosity towards each other. Willoughby visits her after she puts up the billboards and said that there, wasn't any DNA or any eyewitnesses, so he couldn't really do much about her daughter's case. And Mildred, she does scold him for not doing his job properly and instead coming to talk to her about the billboards, but she does seem to realise this and is instead acting out of desperation. She knows that Willoughby is dying, so she wants to get her daughter's case back into the public eye to make sure that it can be solved. But in lashing out against the police department and against Chief Willoughby, all she manages to do is to get the anger of the townspeople, particularly Officer Dixon. Dixon is a very angry person, but because his anger is directionless and sort of aimless, it doesn't actually get any of the desired outcomes that he wants. For example, at the beginning of the film, he tries to antagonise Red the ad man who owns Mildred's billboards. However, despite his authority as a police officer, he never ever seems to be able to get on top of these exchanges. In the bar scene at the beginning, he insults Red and tries to get under his skin by saying, "Red, why are you called Red? Because you're a communist?" And Red, this barely seems to register with him, and he says, "No, it's because I've got red hair." Dixon's temper comes to a head when, after Chief Willoughby commits suicide, he breaks into Red's office, beats him and throws him out a window. Despite the fact that Willoughby's suicide had absolutely nothing to do with the billboards, Dixon mindlessly lashes out and as a result he loses his job. Mildred's anger comes to a head when her billboards are burnt down and she responds by firebombing the police station. She does this at night to try and make sure that nobody gets hurt, but Dixon is in the building at the time and ends up being severely burned. Not only this, but she later finds out that none of the police were responsible for burning them down and that the billboard company had extra material printed in case such a thing were to happen, so her entire action is pointless. In doing this, we can see that the anger and violence is never directly targeted at the actual problem and instead just ends up hurting innocent people or people who are only really tangentially involved. If you haven't seen the film, you're probably A, pretty pissed off that I've spoiled the whole thing, and B, thinking, so what if something bad happens to Mildred and Dixon? They seem like pretty despicable characters. However, I think the film does an excellent job of displaying how the emotional neglect and trauma have led to essentially the characters feeling so powerless that they have to take matters into their own hands. The film implies that initially the murder didn't get very much media coverage at all. At the beginning of the film, it takes Red a while to figure out who Mildred is, whereas as soon as she puts up the billboards, she not only gets a spot on the local TV news, but there are also strangers harassing her in the streets. As such, Mildred's tragedy never gets any media attention, but her vitriol does. There's a really good article in The Atlantic where it talks about anger, and it says for the TV news cycle to keep people tuned in, they need to keep them angry. But I think that the natural response to this is that there's always anger towards the perpetrators, but there's never really sympathy for the victims. This lack of sympathy leads to a world where Dixon can't properly express his emotions, and therefore he responds to grief by beating someone up and throwing them out of a window. Willoughby recognises this tendency in Dixon and says to him that essentially anger is not going to solve any of his problems, and before his suicide he writes him a note saying that he needs love.
Because through love comes calm, and through calm comes thought.
And thought is essentially going to solve his problems. He recognises this is something that Dixon is going to struggle to come to terms with, and therefore promises him that if he's a little bit more calm...
No one will think you're gay.
Which is a terrible way of putting it, but it's apparently quite effective to get through to someone of Dixon's sensibilities. As it happens, when Mildred firebombs the station, Dixon's first thought is not for his own life, but to save the file for her daughter's murder. But that's not to say that the idea behind the film is if you follow Chief Willoughby's example then everything will be fine, because we see throughout the film that his demeanour and inaction can actually cause more problems than they solve. For example, his suicide is meant to prevent tragedy for his wife and daughters, but it actually just makes it a lot worse and makes it a lot more shocking, as well as being so shocking to Dixon that he beats Red and throws him out of a window. As well as this, his inaction in other parts of the film causes more problems than it solves as well, such as the fact that he's completely lax about racism and homophobia in the police force, which of course allows these behaviours to continue and to thrive. As well as this, throughout the entire film, he tries to act as a father figure to Dixon and stir him on the right path, but the way he communicates with him initially is through incredibly violent imagery, such as threatening to kick his mother's teeth in if he doesn't do his work properly, and I would wager that that would probably perpetuate more violence than it actually would stop. So clearly, the film says that there is some room for anger, however you do need calm and empathy to use it effectively. Chief Abercrombie, who's Willoughby's replacement, is the perfect example of this. When he first walks into the police station, the desk sergeant insults him. Abercrombie diffuses the situation by just explaining the joke back to him.
What's your name?
Name's on my tag, man. You hard of reading?
Hard of reading? No, that's good. Hard of reading, kind of like hard of hearing. But it's actually hard of reading. Like a play on words or something, huh?
What do you want?
When it's clear that the same methods don't work on Dixon, he just fires Dixon on the spot.
How are things coming along on that Mildred Hayes case?
How's things coming along in the mind your own fucking business case?
How are things coming along on the hand me your gun and your badge?
As such, it's pretty clear that with empathy there's a line that if you cross it, it stops you from taking decisive decisions, and Abercrombie instinctively knows where this line is, whereas Chief Willoughby definitely didn't. The film explicitly says that anger begets greater anger, but I actually don't even think this is true within the context of the film, and it's actually violence which causes all of the problems. It's violence which takes Mildred's daughter away, it's violence which loses Dixon his job, and Willoughby's suicide, which he intends as an act of love, is really an act of violence that makes everything much, much worse. Also, Mildred and Dixon have a lot of legitimate reasons to be angry. Mildred was trapped in an abusive relationship which led to a hostile home life which led to the horrible tragedy that she suffers from throughout the film. Dixon, on the other hand, can't express his grief properly after his dad died. He's embarrassed that he still lives with his mum and he doesn't have the mental capacity to effect change in his life. But neither of these characters get any real sympathy or empathy as a result of these. Mildred's husband is still out of prison, and not only that, but he's dating a much younger woman. And Dixon has a monologue later on in the film where he says that the only remedy for him not doing very well at school was for his mum telling him to try harder instead of, someone helping him to actually understand and develop his intelligence. As such, these characters have been victimised and ignored, and yet they're just expected to suck it up and continue with their lives. The two are very similar in this way, which is shown at the end of the film. Dixon's newfound calmness allows him to get close enough to a rapist in a bar that he can draw DNA from them. Obviously, he's still angry, but his newfound calm and his genuine desire to do right by Mildred leads to him finally being an effective police officer. Mildred as well is so grateful that someone's finally taking her case seriously that she seriously thanks Dixon for doing right by her, even when it turns out that Dixon drew DNA from the wrong person. Dixon emulates Willoughby's behaviour from earlier in the film and seems very, very content that people have finally noticed his good attributes as well as his bad ones. And this newfound understanding between the two characters leads to both of them travelling up to Idaho to murder the wrong person, which is... we'll get to that. As I said at the start, this film draws a lot of parallel between events which have happened in the last year. For example, the siege on the Capitol and the Black Lives Matter protests, because why shouldn't the perpetrators be angry? If you believe that your government was lying to you, then obviously you would lash out as well. And if people who looked like you were being killed and suffering for absolutely no reason at all, then you would lash out as well. But as a society, we're looking far too much at the results of this anger. We're looking at the small minority of protesters who were looters or were statue topplers, and we're looking at the small minority of Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol. However, unless we start looking at the reasons as to why people are feeling like this, and we start coming up with sympathetic solutions, then we're never ever going to solve these problems. When you take a bunch of people who've been miseducated, lied to, and let down by elected officials for decades, and you call them idiots, then obviously they're just going to get angrier. When you take a bunch of people who've suffered serious injustice and you misrepresent the issue or you undermine their cause, then of course you're just going to make them angrier. We're focusing far too much on the fruits of this anger rather than the actual causes of it, and we should condemn the violent actions and the crimes of people. That's absolutely fine. I've done it myself before, but then the anger isn't going to go away and we have to look at the root causes of it. As Alice Wu said in the South China Morning Post, just because there's a new president in the White House doesn't mean that the situation suddenly disappears, because there are people, even when their rhetoric and their actions are reprehensible, who have legitimate grievances about how the country is being run. I think the Free Billboards understands that listening is the first step towards healing these divides. Obviously it's not perfect, but it is definitely a start. So we don't see whether Mildred and Dixon carry through on their plan to kill the wrong rapist. However, we do see them start to reconsider over whether this is a good idea, which shows that their sympathy for each other has given them a greater scope to understand their anger and how they might best use it. Another example of this is they both say goodbyes to their sleeping loved ones, and it seems like a small thing that happens in a lot of films before someone goes off to do something important. However, it's very poignant in Free Billboards because there's been such intense conflicts between family members throughout the film, and this suggests that with their newfound calm, they might actually be able to heal and have a better relationship with these people around them. Now, obviously, it's not perfect. They're still lashing out. It's not an immediate fix. However, it does show that they still have the scope for calm and for thought, and with that thought comes the ability to find the best place to put their anger. Also, I'm going to start to do a bit more pop culture stuff, so if you think you'd be interested in that, subscribe so you can check that one out, mate. That was a hint. Checking, mate. You know what it is, you know. I don't need to tell you. Or do I? Do you not know? How do you not know? Have you been living under a rock?